Chapter 1. I was on the whole very pleased with my day, not many conflicts and worries, above all not too much self-criticism. I had done almost all the things I wanted to do, and as a result I felt heroic and satisfied. The urge had been upon me for some days past to take myself in hand. What was wrong with me? I couldn't say. Some sort of vague disaffection, a self-rebellion I might call it. The feeling again and again came upon me that as I was nearing 30 I should cease to live like a cow. Perhaps a cow, with justice, might feel hurt at the comparison. Eating, working in a manner of speaking, walking, talking, etc. All done to perfection, I was sure, but always leaving behind a sense of something missing.
I took stock of my daily life. I got up at 8 every day, read for the 50th time Milton, Carlyle and Shakespeare, looked through compositions, swallowed a meal, dressed, and rushed out of the hostel just when the second bell sounded at college. 4 hours later I returned to my room. My duty in the interval had been admonishing, cajoling and browbeating a few hundred boys of Albert Mission College so that they might mug up Shakespeare and Milton and secure high marks and save me adverse remarks from my chiefs at the end of the year. For this pain the authorities kindly paid me 100 rupees on the first of every month and dubbed me a lecturer. One ought, of course, to be thankful and rest content. But such repose was not in my nature, perhaps because I was a poet, and I was constantly nagged by the feeling that I was doing the wrong work. This was responsible for a perpetual self-criticism, and all kinds of things aggravated it. For instance, what my good Chief Brown had said to us that day might be very reasonable, but it irritated and upset me. We were summoned to his room at the end of the day. Under normal conditions, he would welcome us with a smile, crack a joke or two, talk of nothing in particular for a couple of minutes and then state the actual business. But today we found him dry and sullen.
He motioned us to our seats and said, "Could you imagine a worse shock for me? I came across a student of the English Honours, who did not know till this day that honours had to be spelt with a U. He finished his sentence with a sharp, grim laugh. We looked at each other and were at a loss to know what to reply. Our assistant professor, Gajapathy, scowled at us as if it were us who had induced the boy to drop the U. Brown cleared his throat as a signal for further speech, and we watched his lips. He began a lecture on the importance of the English language, and the need for preserving its purity. Brown's 30 years in India had not been ill spent if they had opened the eyes of Indians to the need for speaking and writing correct English. The responsibility of the English department was indeed very great. At this point Gajapathy threw us a further furious look. The chief went on for 45 minutes, and feeling that it was time to leaven his sermon with a little humor, added, "It would be a serious enough blunder even from a mathematics honours man."
When going out I was next to Gajapathy. He looked so heavily concerned that I felt like pricking him so that he might vanish like a bubble leaving no trace behind. But I checked myself. It would be unwise. He was my senior in office, and he might give me an hour of extra work every day, or compel me to teach the history of language, of which I knew nothing. I had to bear with him till we reached the hostel gate. He kept glancing at his own shoulder, swelling with importance. He muttered, "Disgraceful. I never knew our boys were so bad. We cannot pretend that we come out of it with flying colors." I felt irritated and said, "Mr. Gajapathy, there are blacker sins in this world than a dropped vowel." He stopped on the road and looked up and down. He was aghast. I didn't care. I drove home the point. Let us be fair. Ask Mr. Brown if he can say in any of the 200 Indian languages, "The cat chases the rat." He has spent 30 years in India. "It is all irrelevant," said Gajapathy.
Why should he think the responsibility for learning is all on our side and none on his? Why does he magnify his own importance? "Good night," said Gajapathy and was off. I felt angry and insulted, and continued my discussion long after both Gajapathy and Brown were out of my reach. Later when I went for a walk, I still continued the debate. But suddenly I saw illumination and checked myself. It showed a weak, uncontrolled mind, this incapacity to switch off. I now subjected myself to a remorseless self-analysis. Why had I become incapable of controlling my own thoughts? I brooded over it. Needless to say, it took me nowhere. It left me more exhausted and miserable at the end of the day. I felt a great regret at having spent a fine evening in brooding and self-analysis, and then reached a startlingly simple solution. All this trouble was due to lack of exercise and irregular habits, so forthwith I resolved to be up very early next day, go out along the river on a long walk, run a few yards, bathe in the river and regulate my life thus.
After dinner, my friends in the neighboring rooms in the hostel dropped in as usual for light talk. They were my colleagues. One was Rangappa, who taught the boys philosophy, and the other Gopal of the mathematics section. Gopal was sharp as a knife, edge where mathematical matters were concerned, but poor fellow, he was very dumb and stupid in other matters. As a matter of fact, he paid little attention to anything else. We liked him because he was a genius, and in a vague manner we understood that he was doing brilliant things in mathematics. Someday he hoped to contribute a paper on his subject which was going to revolutionize human thought and conceptions. But God knew what it was all about. All that I cared for in him was that he was an agreeable friend, who never contradicted and who patiently listened for hours, though without showing any sign of understanding.
Tonight the talk was all about English spelling and the conference we had with Brown. I was incensed as usual, much to the amazement of Rangappa. But my dear fellow, what do you think they pay you for unless it is for dotting the I's and crossing the T's? Gopal, who had been listening without putting in a word of his own, suddenly became active. I don't follow you, he said. I said the English department existed solely for dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
Oh, he said, opening wide his eyes. I never thought so. Why should you do it? His precise literal brain refused to move where it had no concrete facts or figures to grip. Symbols, if they entered his brain at all, entered only as mathematical symbols. Rangappa answered, Look here, Gopal. You have come across the expression, raining cats and dogs. Yes.
Have you actually seen cats and dogs falling down from the sky? No. No. Why? Rangappa would have worried him a little longer, but the college clock struck 10 and I said, Friends, I must bid you good night. Good night, Gopal repeated mechanically and rose to go. Not so the ever-questioning philosopher. What has come over you? He asked, without moving.
I want to cultivate new habits. What's wrong with the present ones? He asked, and I blinked for an answer. It was a long story and could not stand narration. Rangappa did not even stir from his seat. The other stood ready to depart and waited patiently. Answer me, Rangappa persisted. I want to be up very early tomorrow, I said.
What time? Some time before 5. What for?
I want to see the sunrise and get some exercise before I start work. Very good. Wake me up too. I shall also go with you, said Rangappa, rising. I saw them off at the door. I had an alarm clock on which I could sometimes depend for giving the alarm at the set time. I had bought it years before at a junk store in Madras. It had a reddening face and had been oiled and repaired a score of times. It showed the correct time but was eccentric with regard to its alarm arrangement. It let out a shattering amount of noise, and it sometimes went off by itself and butted into a conversation, or sometimes when I had locked the room and gone out, it started off and went on ringing till exhaustion overcame it.
There was no way of stopping it, by pressing a button or a lever. I don't know if it had ever had such an arrangement. At first I did not know about its trouble, so that I suffered a great shock and did not know how to silence it, short of dashing it down. But one day I learned by some sort of instinctive experiment that if I placed a heavy book like Taine's History of English Literature on its crest, it stopped shrieking. I picked up the cloak and sat on my bed looking at it. I believe I almost addressed it, much depends upon you. I set it at 4, 4:30 and lay down. At 4:30 it shrieked my sleep away. I switched on the light, picked up Tane hurriedly, and silenced it. I went over to Rangappa's room, stood at the window and called him a dozen times, but there was no answer. As I stood looking at his sleeping figure with considerable disgust and pity, he stirred and asked, "Who is there?"
It is nearing 5. You wanted to be called out. Why? You said you would come out.
Not me. It is about 5, I said. It looks to me like midnight. Go back to bed, my dear fellow. Don't hang about windows pestering people. His voice was thick and the last words trailed off into sleep.
I stepped out of the hostel gates. Our college and hostel were not more than a couple of 100 yards from the river. There was a narrow lane to be crossed and at the end of it we were on the sands. As I walked down the lane, a couple of municipal lamps were still burning, already showing signs of paling before the coming dawn. The eastern skyline was reddening, and I felt triumphant. I could not understand how people could remain in bed when there was such a glory awaiting them outside. I thought of Rangappa. A dry philosopher, I suppose, not susceptible to these influences. A hopeless man. In any case, not my business. The sand was damp with the morning dew, but as I buried my feet, they felt deep down the warmth of the previous day's sun. In the half-dark dawn, I saw some persons already out at work, fording the river, bathing and washing.
There were immense banyan trees hanging over the river, and birds stirred and chirped in their nests. I walked on at an even pace, filling my lungs with morning air, and taking great strides. I felt I was really in a new world. I walked nearly 4 miles down the bank. Before turning back, I selected a clean spot, undressed, and plunged into the water. Coming on shore and rubbing myself with the towel, I felt I had a new lease of life. No doubt in my village home and in this very river I had often bathed, but at no other time could I remember such a glow of joy as filled me now. How could I account for it? There was something in the deliberate effort, and the hour and the air and surroundings. Nature, nature, all our poets repeat till they are hoarse. There are subtle and visible emanations in nature's surroundings. With them the deepest in us merges and harmonizes. I think it is the highest form of joy and peace we can ever comprehend. I decided to rush back to my table and write a poem on nature.
I was going to write of the cold water's touch on the skin, the cold air blowing on chest and face, the rumble of the river, cries of birds, magic of the morning light, all of which created an alchemy of inexplicable joy. I paused for a moment and wondered how this poem would be received in a classroom, the grim tolerance with which boys listen to poetry, the annotator's desperate effort to convey a meaning, and the teacher's doubly desperate effort to wrest a meaning out of the poet and the annotator, the essence of an experience lost in all this handling. I returned to my room before 7. I felt very well satisfied indeed with my performance. I told myself, I am all right. I am quite sound if I can do this every day. I shall be able to write 100 lines of poetry, read everything I want to read, in addition to class, work. This gave place to a distinct memory of half a dozen similar resolves in the past and the lapses. I checked this defeatism. Don't you see this is entirely different? I am different today.
How? Asked a voice. I ignored the question and it added, why? Shut up, I cried. Don't ask questions. I myself was not clear as to the why, except that my conscience perpetually nagged over arrears of work, books from libraries and friends lying in a heap on the table untouched, letters unanswered and accumulating, lines of poetry waiting for months to be put on paper, a picture of my wife meant to be framed and hung on the wall, but for months and months standing on the table leaning against the wall in its cardboard mount, covered with dust, bent by the weight of the books butting into it. This table assailed my sight as soon as I entered, and I muttered, must set all this right, as I sat down on my chair. I called Singaram, our servant. He had been a hostel servant for 40 years and known all of us as undergraduates, and now as teachers, an old man who affected great contempt for all of us, including our senior professors and principal. He spoke to us with habitual rudeness.
Somehow he felt that because he had seen all of us as boys, our present stature and age and position were a make-believe, to which he would be no party. "Singaram," I called, and he answered from somewhere, "You will have to wait till I come. If you hurt your throat calling me, don't hold me responsible for it." In a few minutes he stood before me, a shrunken old fellow, with angry wrinkles on his face. "Now what is it this time? Has that sweeper not done her work properly? If she is up to her old tricks, tell the cook to bring my coffee. So late. Why should you dally over your coffee so long, when you ought to be reading at your table?"
I went for a bathe in the river, Singaram. I found it very fine. He was happy to hear it. "I'm glad you are ceasing to be the sort who lounges before bathrooms, waiting for a hot bath. A river bath is the real thing for a real man. I am 80 years old, and have never had a day's sickness, and have never bathed in hot water. Nor in cold water, I think," I said as he went away to send me my coffee.
I made a space on the table by pushing aside all the books, took out a sheet of paper and wrote a poem entitled, Nature, about 50 lines of verse. I read and reread it, and found it very satisfying. I felt I had discharged a duty assigned to me in some eternal scheme. I had 4 hours of teaching to do that day. Lear for the junior BA class, a composition period for the senior arts, detailed prose and poetry for other classes. 4 periods of continuous work, and I hadn't prepared even a page of lecture. I went 5 minutes late to the class, and I could dawdle over the attendance for a quarter of an hour. I picked out the attendance register and called out the first name.
"Here, sir, present," and I marked. 2 boys in the front bench got up and suggested, "Sir, take the attendance at the end of the period." "Sit down please, can't be done. I can't encroach into the next hour's work." A babble rose in the class, a section demanding that the attendance be taken immediately and another demanding postponement. I banged the table with my fist and shouted over the din, "Stop this, otherwise I will mark everyone absent."
"Attendance takes up most of our hours, sir. We can't help it. Your attendance is just as important as anything else. Stop all noise and answer your names, otherwise, I will mark all of you absent." At this the boys became quiet, because I out-shouted them. The lion, tamer's touch. In a sober moment perhaps I would reflect on the question of obedience. Born in different households, perhaps petted, pampered, and bullied, by parents, uncles, brothers, all persons known to them and responsible for their growth and welfare. Who was I that they should obey my command? What tie was there between me and them? Did I absorb their personalities as did the old masters and merge them in mine? I was merely a man who had mugged earlier than they the introduction and the notes in the Verity edition of Lear, and guided them through the mazes of Elizabethan English. I did not do it out of love for them or for Shakespeare, but only out of love for myself.
If they paid me the same 100 rupees for stringing beads together or tearing up paper bits every day for a few hours, I would perhaps be doing it with equal fervor. But such reflections do not mar our peace when we occupy the classroom chair. So that I banged the table, shouted till they were silenced, and went through the attendance. All this tattle swallowed up half an hour. I opened my Verity. I had made a pencil mark where I had stopped on the previous day, middle of the first scene in the third act. I began in a general way. You will see that I stopped last time where Lear faces the storm. This is a vital portion of this great tragedy. The words rang hollow in my ears. Some part of me was saying, these poor boys are now all attention, cowed by your superior force. They are ready to listen to you and write down whatever you may say. What have you to give them in return? I noticed that some boys were already sitting up alert, ready to note down the pearls dropping from my mouth.
I felt like breaking out into a confession. My dear fellows, don't trust me so much. I am merely trying to mark time because I couldn't come sufficiently prepared, because all the morning I have. But I caught myself lecturing. This is the very heart of the tragedy, and I would like you to follow this portion with the greatest attention. I stole a look at the watch. Only 15 minutes more. As usual, I shall read through this scene first, and then I shall take it up in detail. I looked at the page on the table. Enter Lear and Fool. Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage. Blow. You cataracts and hurricanes, spout till you have drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. As I read on, I myself was moved by the force and fury of the storm compressed in these lines. The sheer poetry of it carried me on. And thou, all, shaking thunder,
Strike flat the thick rotundity o' the world. I forgot all about the time, all about my unpreparedness. Let the great gods
that keep this dreadful pother o'er our heads find out their enemies now. I read on. The boys listened attentively. I passed on to the next scene without knowing it. I could not stop.
Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that hide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides defend you
from seasons such as these? At the thought of helpless humanity, I nearly broke down. The bell rung. I shut my book with the greatest relief, and walked out of the class. I managed the composition hour quite easily. The composition hour is a sort of relaxation for us, where we can sit looking at notebooks and do not demand too much attention from the boys.
It was the small gallery room at the end of the southern corridor. I loved this room because the sun came through a ventilator, bringing in a very bright beam of light, and brilliant dust particles floated in it, and the two boys who sat on the second bench looked all aflame. Years and years ago, I sat there on the bench as a student, and Gajapati was then just a junior lecturer and not the big assistant professor he was now. I could still see where I used to sit assiduously cultivating correct language and trying to please the lecturer. And to my left would always sit Rangappa, who hated all composition. Little did I dream then that I would be a teacher in the same class. The boys were making too much noise. I tapped the table lightly and said, Ramaswamy, here is your notebook. See the corrections on it. There are more corrections on it than on any other paper. It was a paraphrase of the poem beginning, My days among the dead are past. He hadn't understood a line of that poem, yet he had written down 2 pages about it.
According to Ramaswamy, though not according to Saudi, the scholar, when he said, My days among the dead are past, meant that he was no longer going to worry about his dead relations because wherever his eyes were cast he saw mighty minds of old. He just copies it down from the poem, and so on and on. I enjoyed this paraphrase immensely. I called, Ramaswamy, come and receive your notebook. My comments on the work could not be publicly shown or uttered. When he came near, I opened the notebook and pointed to my remark at the end of the notebook, startling. I put my finger on this and asked, Do you see what I mean? Yes, sir, whispered Ramaswamy. You are very bad in English.
I am sorry, sir. Does this poem make no sense as far as you are concerned? No, sir.
Then why do you write so much about it? I do not know, sir. All right, go back to your seat. Come and see me sometime.
Yes, sir. When? I couldn't answer this question, because I visualized all my hours so thoroughly allotted for set tasks that I was at a loss to know when I could ask him to see me. So I replied, I will tell you, go to your seat. I spent the rest of the period giving a general analysis of the mistakes I had encountered in this batch of composition, rather very, as such, for hence, split infinitives, collective nouns, and all the rest of the traps that the English language sets for foreigners. I then set them an exercise in essay, writing on the epigram, Man is the master of his own destiny. An idiotic theme, I felt, this abstract and confounded metaphysic, but I could not help it. I had been ordered to set this subject to the class.
I watched with interest how the boys were going to tackle it. As a guidance, it was my duty to puff up this theme, and so I wrote on the blackboard, man, what is man? What is destiny? How does he overcome destiny? How does destiny overcome him? What is fate? What is free will? A number of headings which reduced man and his destiny and all the rest to a working formula for these tender creatures to handle. By the afternoon I had finished 3 hours of lecturing, and was, with a faintly smarting throat, resting in a chair in the common room. There were a dozen other teachers. As each of them sat looking at a book or at the ceiling vacantly, there was a silence which seemed to me oppressive. I never liked it. I had my own technique of breaking it. I remarked to no one in particular, we have to decide an important issue before the examinations begin. The others looked up with bored half-expectancy. We will have to call a staff meeting to decide how many marks are to be deducted for spelling honors without the middle U. No, I don't think it is necessary, said Sastry, the logic lecturer, who had a very straightforward, literal mind, looking up for a moment from the 4-day-old newspaper which he was reading. Gajapati looked over his spectacles, and remarked from the farthest end of the room, you are joking over yesterday's meeting, I suppose? I replied, I am not joking, I am very serious.
What is it all about? Dr. Menon asked. He was assistant professor of philosophy. Gajapati explained, slowly, like an expert lawyer, what had happened the previous evening. No sense of proportion, was the philosopher's verdict. Gajapati removed his spectacles, folded the sides, and put them away as a preparation for dispute. How would you treat one of your students if he spelt can't? I wouldn't bother very much if he knew correctly what Kant had or hadn't said, replied Dr. Menon.
Oh, I won't believe it, said Gajapati, there is a merit in accuracy, which must be cultivated for its own sake. I believe it wouldn't do to slacken anywhere. Americans spell honors without the U, I said, and this diverted the subject, and deprived Gajapati of the duel for which he was preparing. Americans are saner than their English cousins in most matters, said Dr. Menon, who had obtained his PhD at Columbia University. I think the American spelling is foolish buffoonery, said Gajapati with his loyalty of a lifetime to English language and literature.
If we had Americans ruling us, I suppose we would say the same thing of the English people, I said. Politics need not butt in everywhere. There are times when I wish there were no politics in the world and no one knew who was ruling and how, said Gajapati. This would help a little clearer, freer thinking in all matters. The whole of the West is in a muddle owing to its political consciousness, and what a pity that the East should also follow suit. It is like a weed choking all other human faculties. Shelley in his sensitive plant. I am afraid your opinions are at least 1,000 years behind the times. It is a one-sided view, Mr. Gajapati, said Kumar, who lectured on political science to BA classes. Corporate life marks the beginning of civilized existence and the emergence of its values.
I am sure, I said, finding the debate dull, a tormenting question can be framed for the boys at the next examination. Corporate existence pulled the caveman out into the open. Discuss. If I have anything to do with the politics paper, I am going to insist on this question and make it compulsory. It will serve the young rascals right. You haven't yet dropped the frivolous habits of your college days, Krishna, said Gajapati. You must cultivate a little more seriousness of outlook. I have answered an advertisement I saw in an American paper where someone has offered to take on hand people who lack seriousness and turn them into better citizens. I have filled up the necessary coupon and have every hope you will find me passable along.
Don't you believe too much in these ads? In the United States, there are any number of them. Once when I was in Chicago, began Dr. Menon of Columbia University, and the bell rung and all his audience rose to go to their different classes. I returned to my room. The postman had slipped through the door 2 letters for me. I knew the pale blue envelope from my wife, who was in the habit of underlining the town 3 times. She seemed to be always anxious lest the letter should go off to some other town. And then my father's letter, from the village. Letters are very exciting things for me. I don't know why. By the time I open and see the contents, I feel an eon might have passed, and my heart goes thumping against my ribs. I looked through my father's letter first. He still wrote his fine, sharp hand, every letter put down with precision and care but without ornament, written closely on a memo pad of some revenue department. From time immemorial he had written only on those pads. No one knew how many pads he had or how he had come by them, perhaps through the favor of some friend in the revenue department.
The paper had acquired an elegant tone of brown through years of storing, but it was tough as parchment. My father had a steel pen with a fat green wooden handle, with which he had written for years. He had several bottles of ink his own make from a recipe which was exclusively his and of which he was excessively proud. He would make up his store of ink once a year, and we little ones of the household waited for the event with tremendous enthusiasm. All the servants in the house would be present. A special brick oven was raised in the backyard, with a cauldron sizzling over it all day, and father presiding. The most interesting part, however, would be the trip the previous evening for shopping to Kavadi, our nearest town, 15 miles off. At 3 in the afternoon, father would yoke the big bulls to the wagon and we were dressed and ready for the expedition, I and my elder brother, and my 2 sisters. My elder brother would exact obedience and we would have to take our seats in the cart according to his directions. The way he handled us, we always expected he would become a commander of an army or a police officer, but the poor fellow settled as auditor in Hyderabad and was led by his wife. He was always full of worries, being a father of 10, and having a haughty nagging wife. He seldom visited us in the village, being so much wrapped up in his own auditing and family.
We reached Kavadi at about 2 o'clock. Invariably I would fall to sleep lulled by the jingling of the bells around the neck of the bulls. Kavadi was a wonderful place for one like me from the village, a street full of all sorts of shops, sewing machines rattling away, colored ribbons streaming down from shop fronts. My father had his favorite shop. The shopman would seat us all on the mat, and my father would buy us some edibles from the opposite shop, while the ingredients were being packed. He would buy us each a toy, a ball, a monkey dangling at the end of a rubber piece, and a doll, and invariably an exercise book and a pencil for my elder brother, declaring that he was past the age of having toys, a reminder which made him smart every time he heard it.
The road would be ankle-deep in bleached dust, and the numerous cattle and country carts passing along stirred it up so much that a cloud always hung over the road, imparting an enchanting haze to the whole place, though, by the time we started back, so much of this dust settled on our skins and hair that our mother had to give us a bath as soon as we reached home. I don't know why my father took this ink business so very seriously, when we could buy all the ink we wanted in the shop and save ourselves all bother. He would be near his brick kiln the whole of the next day boiling up this potion, and distilling, and straining, and filling up huge mud jugs. He filled small glass pots for our use, and locked up the store in an almirah. We wrote our copies and lessons in this ink. It had a greenish tint which we didn't like, and which made us long for the blue or black ink sold in the shop. We never got over the feeling that this ink was not real ink, perhaps because of its pale greenish tinge, but my father seemed to appreciate it for that very reason, declaring that you couldn't buy that elegant shade even if you paid a fortune for it.
My father's letter brought back to me not only the air of the village and all my childhood, but along with it all the facts: home, coconut, garden, harvest, revenue demand. He had devoted nearly a paragraph to my mother's health, with a faint suggestion of complaint that she was not looking after herself quite properly, still keeping late hours for food, the last to eat in the house, and still reluctant to swallow the medicines given to her. And then came a paragraph of more immediate interest to me. Your father-in-law has written a letter today. I hear that by God's grace, your wife Sushila and the baby are keeping well. He suggests that you should take her and the baby and set up a family and not live in a hostel any longer. He has my entire concurrence in this matter, as I think in the best interests of yourself you should set up a family. You have been in the hostel too long, and I don't feel you ought to be wasting the best of your life in the hostel, as it will affect your health and outlook. Your mother is also of the same view, since your father-in Law's place is not a very healthy one for an infant.
If you have no serious objection to this, your father-in-law suggests the 10th of next month as the most suitable and auspicious date. He was a BA of the olden days, brought up on Pater and Carlyle and Scott and Browning, personally looked after by Dr. William Miller, Mark Hunter and other eminent professors of Madras College. He was fastidious and precise in handling the English language, though with a very slight pomposity inevitable in the men of those days. After passing his BA, he refused to enter government service, as many of his generation did, but went back and settled in his village and looked after his lands and property. I said to myself on reading his letter, God, what am I to do with a little child of 7 months? This somehow seemed to terrify me. How did one manage these things? I had visited my wife's place 3 or 4 times since the baby was born. At the first trip, I could hardly take notice of the child, although for my wife's sake I had to pinch its cheeks.
I no doubt felt a mild affection for it, but there was nothing compelling or indispensable about it. During the subsequent interviews, I found more interest in the girl and began to feel that it would be nice to have her about the home, cooing and shouting. But I didn't bargain to accept her guardianship so suddenly. I had seen my sister's children of that age, 7 months or 8 months old, and they started howling and crying at nights till we felt that they would not survive whatever was afflicting them. But my mother was there, and she could take them in hand expertly. A fermentation, a rub with an oil, some decoction down their throats, and they were quietened. My father's letter had a postscript. To help you set up the family, your mother is quite willing to come and stay with you for a few weeks. I have not the slightest objection.
I put down my father's letter. There was much food for thought in it. I smelt my wife's letter before opening it. It carried with it the fragrance of her trunk, in which she always kept her stationery. A mild jasmine smell surrounded her and all her possessions ever since I had known her. I hurriedly glanced through her letter. In her uniform rotund hand, she had written a good deal about the child, which made me want to see her at once. The baby was really too intelligent for her age, understood everything that was being said and done in the house. There was every indication that she was going to prove the most astonishingly intelligent person in the family. She crawled on her belly all over the place, and kept a spy-like watch on her mother's movements.
Too cunning. She was learning to say, Appa, father, and with every look was asking her mother when father proposed to take them home, I like this, but was not prepared to accept it totally. She then referred to the letter from my father and her father and requested me to set up a house at the earliest moment possible. I felt I was someone whose plans and determinations were of the utmost importance to others. I placed the letter on the table, locked the room, and went out for a wash. While crossing the quadrangle, my eyes fell on a jasmine bush which completely covered our library wall. I had seen it as a very young sapling years and years ago. When I was a student, I had taken a special interest in its growth, and trained it up a small bamboo bower which I had put up with the help of Singaram, the old peon. Many persons had laughed at me for it. Why should we grow a jasmine bush in a boys' hostel? I was often asked. Just to remind us that there are better things in the world, that is all, I replied. It was a struggle for existence for that plant, all kinds of cows trespassing into the compound and biting off the stalk. It went up and down several times, causing me unending anxiety. And then one day I got the idea of entrusting it to Singaram's care with the suggestion that he might take its flowers, if they appeared, to his women folk at home and for the god during the celebration of the Vinayak festival in the hostel. Since then it grew up under his personal care.
He dealt severely with persons who went near it, and as a special favor, occasionally left half a dozen buds on the sill of my window. Now as I passed along to the bathroom, I looked at it and said, I am about to leave you, after all these years, after 10 years, the period I had spent in the hostel, first as student and then as teacher. I sighed as I passed it, the only object of any beauty hereabouts. The rest of the quadrangle was mere mud, scorched by Malgudi sun. I had to wait in the bathroom passage for some time, all the cubicles were engaged. Behind the doors, to the tune of falling water, a couple of boys were humming popular film songs. I paced the passage with the towel round my neck. It was a semi-dark, damp place, with a glass tile giving it its sole lighting. I shall soon be rid of this nuisance, I reflected, when I have a home of my own. Hostel bathrooms are hell on earth. God said to his assistants, "Take this man away to hell," and they brought him down to the hostel bathroom passage, and God said, "Torture him," and they opened the room and pushed him in. No, no, at this moment the angel said, "The room is engaged." God waited as long as a God can wait and asked, "Have you finished?" And they replied, "Still engaged," and in due course they could not see where their victim was, for grass had grown and covered him up completely while he waited outside the bathroom door.
This promises to be a good poem. Must write it someday. At this moment a door opened and someone came out dripping. It was a student of the second-year class. He asked agitatedly, "Sir, have I kept you waiting long?" "Yes, my dear fellow, but how could you come out before finishing that masterpiece of a song?" The other held the door ostentatiously open and I passed in. I was back in my room. I applied a little hair cream, stood before the small looking glass hanging by the nail on the wall, and tried to comb. The looking glass was in the southern wall and I could hardly see my face. "Nuisance," I muttered, picked up the glass, and looked for a place to hang it on. Not a place. Light at the window struck me in the face and dazzled. "The room is full of windows," I muttered. "These petty annoyances of life will vanish when I have a home of my own."
My dear wife will see that the proper light comes at the proper angle. I finally put the looking glass down on the table. It had a stand which would not support it. I picked up Taine's History of Literature and leaned the glass against it. "Taine every time," I muttered and combed my hair back, interrupting the operation for a moment to watch the spray from the comb wet, dotting the covers of books and notebooks on the table. I paused for a moment gazing at my face in the glass. This is how, I suppose, I appear to that girl and the little one. Yet they have confidence that I shall be able to look after them and run a home. I was ready to start out. I picked up the letters, smelt once again my wife's epistle, and sat back in the chair, and read the letter over again, without missing a single word. I want to see the baby and her mother very badly. How long am I to be in this wretched hostel? I said to myself.
I leaned back, reflecting. Through my window I could see the college tower and a bit of the sky. I had watched through this window the play of clouds and their mutation for a decade. All that was to be learnt about clouds was learnt by me, sitting in this place, and looking away, while studying for examinations or preparing lectures. I started out. At the hostel gate I saw Rangappa standing. He was involved in a discussion with Subbaram, an assistant in the economics department. I tried to go away pretending not to have seen him. "Krishn, Krishn." "Just a moment," Rangappa cried on seeing me. He turned to his friend and said, "Let us refer it to a third party." I stopped. "You see," began Rangappa. "The point is this."
"No, let me first say what it is," the other interrupted. "What place would you give to economic values?" he began. "It all depends," I said ironically, without allowing him to finish the sentence.
No, don't put it that way," interrupted Rangappa. "I will simplify it for you. Is 100% materialism compatible with our best traditions? Just another of our numerous discussions going on night and day among my colleagues, leading God knew where. What pleasure or profit did they get by it? I will give the matter deep consideration and tell you in due course," I said, and moved away. Rangappa cried, "Wait, I will go with you." "I am not going for a walk but to search for a house," I said, and went away.
I must have a house, I told myself, which faces south, for its breeze, keeps out the western sun, gets in the eastern, and admits the due measure of northern light that artists so highly value. The house must have a room for each one of us and for a guest or two. It must keep us all together and yet separate us when we would rather not see each other's faces. We must have helpful people and good people near at hand, but obnoxious neighbors 10 miles away. It must be within walking distance of college and yet so far out as to let me enjoy my domestic life free from professional intrusions. I spent the entire evening scouring various parts of the town watching for "to let" signs.
The builder of this house must have been dead, drunk while doing the latter portion of the house. This is a house evidently intended for monkeys to live in. This house must have been designed by a tuberculosis expert so that his business may prosper for the next 100 years. This house is ideal for one whose greatest desire in life is to receive constant knocks on his head from door posts. A house for a twisted pygmy. Thus, variously, I commented within myself as I inspected the vacant houses in the east, west and south of the town. I scoured South Extension, Fort Area, Racecourse Road, and Vinayak Mudali Street. I omitted Lawley Extension because it was expensive, and also the new extension beyond it, because it was too far out of the way. The search extended over 3 or 4 days. I could think of nothing but houses all the while. The moment I met anyone I asked, "Can you suggest a good house?" I was becoming a bore, capable of talking of nothing but houses, night and day. I got into the habit of taking aside my students and asking them about it. I was becoming anxious. The day was fast approaching when my wife and child would be arriving. There didn't appear to be a single house fit for their occupation in the whole town.
Suppose 15 days hence I was still in this state and they arrived and had nowhere to go outside the railway station. This vision was a nightmare to me. However, I was spared. One of my students knew somebody who knew somebody else who had a house in Sarayu Street, and who was eager to have a good, cultured family as tenants. Am I good? Is mine a cultured family? I asked myself immediately. Sarayu Street was a coveted spot in the town. It fulfilled almost all the conditions that are looked for in a residential locality: cheap houses, refined surroundings, and yet near enough to the market and the offices. I fell into feverish anxiety over this house. The boy promised to take me to the first link in the chain of introductions on the following morning. I was too impatient to wait till then. I implored him, "There is no sense in postponing these matters. Somebody else may be there before me. Let us go today." I visualized the whole town waiting to crowd into the house and fight for it. The boy begged to be let off today since his evening was already committed to some other duty, but I brushed aside all his explanations and clung to him fast. He took me to his house behind the market, and then to someone a mile east of the market, and finally an old man hunched up in a rag-covered cane chair on the veranda of a house in Elaman Street.
It was a very narrow place with the tiles touching one's head, and the chair completely filled the veranda. The old man fussed about on my arrival and compelled me to sit on a stool, which was placed on the edge of the veranda, and I was in constant danger of being tipped off into the street if I moved my limbs a little carelessly. So I sat there holding my breath. He was a very shrunken, palsied patriarch. His sight was dim. He strained his eyes to catch a glimpse of me, but did not succeed. A silence fell between us. I broke it by asking, "Are you the owner of the house?" "No," he replied, promptly, in his querulous voice. "God is the owner and I am his slave." "What is the rent?"
"First see the house and tell me if you like it." I felt rather cowed by his authoritarian manner. I ventured, "I can't do anything unless I know something about it." He shook his head reflectively. "Do you want the garage or not?" "Has it a garage?" I asked. "Don't ask all that now," said the old man.
"Unless I know first if it has a garage," I said. "You want everything to be told first," he snapped with disgust, "before you say anything yourself. Go away. I am not prepared to talk to you anymore. I don't want to give you my house. I have seen hundreds like you come and ask questions and vanish out of sight. What is the matter with you?" I asked indignantly. He bent close to my face and said, "I am semi-blind. Till 3 months ago, I could see clearly, but it came on suddenly. And I can't talk without faltering. That's what paralysis has done for me. Speaking is a strain to me. Otherwise, I am prepared to sit here a whole day and wag my tongue to your heart's content, not caring whether you are a true tenant or a bogus one who comes and pesters me by the score each day. I will send the boy along with the key. See the house and then come and talk to me.
All right, I said. He called a boy, pressed into his hand a large rusty key and said, "Show this master the bungalow." "Show him every cupboard," he commanded. I followed the boy out. On the way I tried to engage him in friendly conversation, but he did not want it. He had his pocket filled with fried nuts, and was ceaselessly transferring them to his mouth. He walked 10 yards ahead. "What class are you reading in?" "I won't read," he replied. He tossed the key up and caught it in mid-air. He led me through some maze of lanes and took me to Sarayu Street. Mine was the last house in a particular row. I liked it at first sight. A small wooden gate, 10 yards of garden space, and then 4 steps up to a gabled veranda. There was a small room opening on the veranda detached from the main house. I went in and threw the window open, a lovely view of Sarayu Street. When I have nothing else to do, I told myself, I can watch the goings-on of Sarayu Street. This room is evidently built for me, where I can study and write without disturbing the household or being disturbed. Why has this been untenanted so long? I asked the boy, without hoping for a reply as the boy waited for me tossing up the lock and key. But he seemed to have melted towards me, and promptly replied, "Because grandfather refuses to give it."
When was this last occupied? 15 days ago, he said. Is that all? I asked, but he suddenly lapsed into his silent ways once again.
I liked the house very much. It had a central hall, where all of us can meet, and a small room at one end of the hall. This must be her room and the child's, I told myself. The kitchen and other portions of the house were very satisfactory. There was a coconut tree in the backyard. When a monkey goes up that tree, I can show it to the child, I said, viewing it from the tiny back veranda. I went back to the old man and said, "I will take the house." "What is the rent?" He reflected. "Do you want it with or without a garage?" I studiously avoided asking if it had a garage at all and where. I merely said, with a trembling diplomacy, "What'll be the difference with or without?" "Suppose I want a garage?"
He made a gesture of utter despair. "I don't like you to brag about all that unnecessarily. Empty talk. Don't pretend you own a car. You have come walking. Even if I'm blind, do you think I can't notice it?" "Look here," I cried, losing all patience. "If you are letting the house, let it, otherwise don't talk of matters which are not your concern. I'm not here to learn lessons from you. I am myself a teacher, and I teach 1,000 boys in that college, mind you." He was greatly impressed. "College teacher." He gave a salute with both hands and said, "I revere college teachers, our gurus. Meritorious deeds in previous births make them gurus in this life. I'm so happy. I only wanted a good, cultured family."
Everybody knows how good we are, and how cultured our family is. I replied haughtily. This had the desired effect. I added, "Don't mistake me for an ordinary person." I drew myself up proudly. He was tremendously impressed. His face beamed with relief. "Do you know why I want a cultured family?" He whispered as if it were a state secret. "I'm going away to live with my son after letting the house, and I want someone who will send me the rent without fail." "Depend upon me," I said. "What shall I have to pay you?" 25 on the 5th of every month. It must reach me on that day at Bellary.
Very well. And what about the garage? I asked haughtily. "I'll build you one if you want, but 10 rupees extra," he said. "All right. I will tell you when I need one," I said.
4 days later my table and trunk and chair were loaded into a bullock cart, my old room was locked up and the key was handed to Singaram. My hostel friends stood on the veranda and cracked a joke or two. The hostel was a place where people constantly arrived and departed, and it was not in anyone's nature there to view these matters pensively. Rangappa and the mathematics man stood on the veranda and said, "Well, goodbye, friend. Good luck. Don't forget us for the house warming," and laughed. Singaram had been very busy the whole day packing up and loading my things. He had attended on me for 10 years, sweeping my room, counseling me and running my errands. He walked behind the creaking cart, warning the driver, "When you unload, remove the trunk first and the table last. If I hear that you have broken any leg, I will break your head, remember." I walked behind the cart. Singaram had come to the border of his domain, the hostel drive, and stopped. He salaamed me and said, "Don't forget our hostel, keep visiting us now and then." He hesitated for a moment and said, "Now permit this old man to go." It was his hint that the time had come for him to receive his reward. He nearly held out his hand for it. I took out my purse and put a rupee on his palm. He looked at me coldly and said, "Is this all the value you attach to the old man?" "Yes," I replied. "I should have given half that to anyone else." No, don't say so. Don't grudge an honest man his payment. I've been your servant for 10 years. Do you know what Professor X gave me when he left this hostel?" "I don't want all that information," I said, and added a nickel to the rupee. He said, "Don't grudge an old servant his due. You will perhaps not see me again. I will perhaps be dead. Next year I'm retiring and going back to my village. You will never see me again. You will be very sorry when you hear that old Singaram is dead and that you wouldn't give the poor fellow 8 annas more." I put in his hand an 8 anna coin. He bowed and said, "God will make you a big professor one day," and walked away. I passed out of the hostel gate, following my caravan and goods.